And welcome to the David Bradford C-PREE seminar. I'm David Wilco, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing today's speaker, Robert Bonney, who also happens to be an old and dear friend of mine. Robert Bonney is currently a Rubenstein Fellow at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment, and in that capacity, he has launched a program to develop strategies to engage people in rural America in climate change mitigation and land conservation, largely through the use of economic incentives. He is also part of the leadership of an interdisciplinary research program at Duke with a goal of ultimately decarbonizing the U.S. economy. Prior to joining the faculty at Duke, from 2013 to 2017, Robert Bonney was Undersecretary for Natural Resources and Environment at the Department of Agriculture. In that capacity, he oversaw management of the U.S. National Forests, 193 million acres, as well as the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And he also oversaw implementation of the conservation provisions of the Farm Bill, which is probably the most consequential piece of legislation affecting your lives that you are unaware exists and affects your lives. But it's written about once every 10 years and is enormously important. Although Robert would never self-describe himself as this, he indeed had the reputation during the Obama administration as being the go-to person for really all environmental issues related to agriculture and forestry at the federal level, and was both highly regarded and highly influential with really all stakeholders who grappled with environmental issues related to agriculture and forestry. And before he was confirmed as Undersecretary for Natural Resources and Environment, he served as the Senior Advisor for Environment and Climate to the Secretary of Agriculture. Prior to his service in the Obama administration, Robert directed the Center for Conservation Incentives at the Environmental Defense Fund, which is where I got to know him. And in that capacity, he developed programs that would encourage private landowners to restore natural ecosystems and habitats for endangered species. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to Princeton, Robert Bonney.
Great, thank you, David. I remember one of the first times I came to Princeton, I came here as a part of an athletic team for Harvard. And I spent the first night in a hotel, and about 2 o'clock in the morning, the Princeton students went and pulled the fire alarm in the hotel. And so out marched the Harvard soccer team, football team, women's soccer team, with grudging respect of Princeton students and their sense of humor. Anyway, it's great to be back here. Great to see you, David, of course. And so I want to talk about fire today. And you've all seen the pictures on CNN, the news, the rising threat of forest fires and wildfire in the United States. This is a shot from the Bitterroot National Forest in the year 2000. It was at the time thought to be a really large and destructive fire. You can see the elk standing in the Bitterroot River there. But this fire, like a lot of fires, was a more rural fire. A lot of acres, but not a lot of people and houses. Let's see if I can't get this to work. Oops, sorry. Try this. No. With the mouse. All right, sorry. All right. So when you spend 8 years at a federal agency, you've got all these people that actually can help you with this sort of stuff. So you never actually have to worry about this stuff until you get out. So, all right, how do I advance? Let me just hit return. All right, so this is the fire that many of you saw on the news last year, the Camp Fire in California. And one of the things you've seen over the last couple decades is more and more of these fires actually moving from the back country in places like the Bitterroot National Forest into the front country and into areas that are highly populated. So the Camp Fire burned 150,000 acres, some public land, but actually a lot of private land, so it was mixed public and private. 18,000 structures, I think almost 90 people died. I think more than 16 billion lost in property and damages, and certainly over probably $100 million in terms of firefighting expenses. And we've also heard of the stories of folks actually trying to flee these fires, the danger in these fires that have come into what we call the wildland-urban interface. And here you see cars that where literally people had to get out of the cars to flee the fire. When I was at USDA, we had a fire called the Butte Fire, also in California in 2015, where during the first couple hours of the fire, the Forest Service was literally, and the state agency was literally running air tankers and helicopters over a road like this to drop retardant just so people could get out of neighborhoods. And so, and I could tell you lots of stories just like those. The human cost, the cost in lives, in firefighter lives, has been enormous. And there's a sense, and you'll hear this on the news, you'll hear people talk about, quote unquote, the new normal. Fires have gotten bigger, they've gotten more destructive, they cover more acres. And the question is, how do we get here? And so what I want to talk about today is how we got here. And you'll hear this debate between management and climate change and other factors, and I want to explore some of that today. So one of the things you've heard talk about in the media coverage of these fires and in the aftermath is the role of management, forest management, wildland management in the context of wildfire. It's not raking. But that doesn't mean that management didn't have an important role to play. But you see folks on some side of the argument say this is fundamentally about forest management. We need to do more timber harvesting. You heard that from Trump. You heard it from former Secretary of Interior Zinke. You hear others talk about, no, this is fundamentally a climate change problem. We have to address climate change. And then we also have issues like where we build houses in the places in the wildland-urban interface and those types of issues. And so what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about the nature of the problem. What role does management play? How important is forest management in addressing this issue? What role does climate change? And then I want to talk about the third leg of the stool, which is development in the wildland-urban interface. And at the end, I want to offer some solutions for how we move forward on this. And one of the things I'll talk a little bit about, in order to really make significant progress on this challenge, we need to get by some of our own mythology around the nature of the problem, the causes of the problems, and the solution. And we also need to recognize that this is an expensive problem. We've built up a lot of debt over a long period of time, and it's going to take money to change it. So of course, fire is a natural process. It's been with us for millennia across the globe and in the United States. Here you see in the upper left a classic longleaf pine of the southern coastal plain, once covered 90 million acres. When Bartram and other naturalists explored the U.S. South, this is largely what they saw across huge expanses. And this is a fire-maintained ecosystem. There's actually some thought that the trees and the vegetation here are actually pyrogenic because it'll favor them from a competitive standpoint. But even hardwood ecosystems like the oak savanna you see on the right in Wisconsin. We had both fires from lightning strikes, but we had millions of Native Americans already living here, and they were really good at using fire for management, for agriculture, for improving game habitat. And so fire has been part of ecosystems for a long time. Some ecosystems like these burn on a very short rotation, every 2 to 3 years, for example, and the fires stay below crown level. It's largely a grassland fire. But there are also ecosystems like lodgepole pine that might burn on a 30, 40, 50, 100-year rotation where you get more catastrophic fires, and trees have developed things like serotinous cones in order to deal with it. But the question for us today, and kind of an important question, is are the fires we're seeing today, the campfire and other fires, are those natural fires? Or have we changed ecosystems and the climate to such a degree that we no longer can think of them as purely a natural phenomenon? See if I go back. So as we think about this question of how important is management, and let's start there. We'll start with management, we'll go to climate, and then we'll go to the wildland-urban interface. A good place to start is with these two gentlemen. So Theodore Roosevelt on your left, Gifford Pinchot on your right. We all know that Theodore Roosevelt was a huge figure in conservation and the creation of the National Forest System and national wildlife refuges. Of course, as a young man, he thought he might actually be a scientist first. He was a renowned hunter. He and Gifford Pinchot became friends in the 1800s, or in the late 1890s. And Roosevelt really, he'd spent time in the West. He'd seen game herds dying off. As he would go to visit every year, there'd be fewer game. Pinchot and him both saw the loss of forests in places like the southeastern coastal plain and in the upper Midwest, and a sense of them and many people in America that we were losing something, that the great bison herds, that wildlife, that the frontier had closed, a sense that, that there was a need to preserve conservation for the benefit of all people. And so Roosevelt begins his conservation crusade, and for him, forests were really central to it. And his sort of staffer, as you were, on conservation was Gifford Pinchot. And so in 1905, they established the U.S. Forest Service at the Department of Agriculture. It takes what had been lands that were in the forest reserves, which had been created in the previous 15 years, and it transfers those to the U.S. Forest Service and to the National Forest System, and they began transferring more and more lands. You can imagine there were a few Western senators and others didn't take too kindly to this, so the new agency in many ways there were people in Congress that were pushing back hard, keeping it underfunded. These were just Yale foresters, right, that were trying to take forest lands away from utilization and from industry and others. And at that time, they had already, lots of folks in conservation had already begun to think of fire as a scourge, of something that needed to be dealt with. But as this new agency is being formed, right, you start to see fire become part of the culture of the agency. If any of you have read Timothy Egan's book about the Big Burn, he talks about this 3 million acre fire in Montana, Idaho, and eastern Washington that landed on the front pages of papers across the country. 87 people die, I think most of them firefighters, but a huge fire that had been brought about by a substantial drought. And then it's thought that a lot of railroad sparks off the railroad had started this massive fire. That fire and others created a sense that part of the reason for the Forest Service's very being was to deal with the scourge of wildfire. And so the Big Burn and others started to create in this agency a sense that not only was fire and reducing the threat of fire part of the agency, it was actually a predicate to sustainable forestry. The two things were actually married. And so this sense of fire as a problem becomes central to the U.S. Forest Service. It becomes central to forest industry, to forestry schools, right? This becomes sort of a central part of how people think about managing forests. And it infected everything the U.S. Forest Service did. So I showed you that slide of the longleaf pine. That slide's actually from my family's land. And just at the turn of the century, my family bought land in South Carolina that was in southern pine, and it was my great-great-uncle Dudley was a quail hunter. He wanted to hunt quail, and he wanted a property where he could do that. And so my family began managing that property for wildlife. And there was a guy named Herbert Stoddard who, like a lot of Southerners, he was actually from Wisconsin, but he started the Tall Timbers Research Station in Georgia, Georgia and Florida, I should say. And like a lot of folks, fire was actually still used in South. It was used for grazing and other things, and so Stoddard was a biologist who really realized the value of fire, and he wrote this book on the bobwhite quail, and one of the things he wrote about was the important role that fire played in the ecosystem. My grandfather invited Stoddard to come to our property in the early 1930s. And my grandfather had read the bobwhite quail book by Stoddard. He'd read it multiple times. Stoddard shows up and gets out of the car and looks and says, "Oh, you just need to burn this place. You need to do as much prescribed fire as you can do." And my grandfather said, "Yeah, but I read your book and you were pretty tepid about using fire." And Stoddard said, "You're right, because the U.S. Forest Service made me water down the chapter on fire." So not only was this something that the Forest Service was infecting the way they thought about management of their own lands, it was such an ideological principle of the agency that it was actually influencing what other people were doing. And Stoddard was funded by USDA. So the Forest Service was able to water down that work. And so the Forest Service literally sent sociologists, psychologists to the Southeast United States to figure out, why are these people still burning their lands? This is crazy. Fire is a huge problem. So it affected everything the Forest Service did. And you can imagine if you take fire out of these ecosystems for a few decades, the ecosystems start to change. Fuels begin to change, fuels build up, the forests begin to look differently. If they catch on fire, they begin to behave differently. And so this ideological principle that became part of the Forest Service, that all fire is bad, has had enormous consequences for those slides of those fires that I showed you today. Of course, there's this guy, right? In 1944, the Forest Service creates an ad campaign that is about Smokey Bear, right? A little sideline here. I mean, one of the things I'm proudest of at my time at USDA is, if you look at this, you think, okay, the pants don't actually fit that well. It's maybe a little out of shape, right? And so when I got to USDA, we thought, we're going to toughen this guy up a little bit. And so, we had him spend time with the Terminator, got him into the gym. We turned Smokey Bear into a badass. But the broader point is, you're one of the most recognizable figures to kids these days if you poll them as Smokey Bear, right? This became, and Wildfire was bad. Now, if you go look at Smokey Bear's website today, you will note that it's a little bit more nuanced. Smokey Bear actually talks about prescribed fire and controlled burns. But the broader point here is that exclusion won the day, right? Fire exclusion won the day, and that's had big consequences for the way our fire problem is dealt with today. Now today, the Forest Service, things started to change in the 60s and 70s, just as we gained more knowledge about ecology, conservation biology. The Forest Service began to hire more biologists and others. The agency's view of this issue changed. Today, the Forest Service is very much about restoration. How do we restore more natural fire regimes? And so, in terms of how the Forest Service actually thinks about this problem, the past mythology about fire has been dropped. This is a stand on the Malheur National Forest that has actually gone through restoration. This is an area that had been where fire hadn't been allowed to go in. And in order to reintroduce fire, you see the stumps in the foreground here. They've actually gone in, they've reduced some of the trees in the mid-story so that they can then reintroduce fire. This is what a lot of forest management on the National Forest is about today. It's about trying to restore more natural conditions, yes, supply wood to timber mills, but to do it in a way that we can actually address the fire issue. And so during the Obama administration, a lot of our efforts were to try and essentially restore more natural forest conditions, in part to actually deal with the fire challenge. The problem is that we've had decades of fire suppression. There are tens of millions of acres on the national forests, on other public lands, and on private lands where the fuel conditions are significantly problematic. They're dangerous. Now, if you think back before white folks showed up in America, there was actually a lot of fire. Tens of millions of acres burned annually as Native Americans utilized fire. As the Forest Service came in and the forest industry and state agencies began that fire suppression campaign, by the mid-60s, we were probably burning 3 to 4 million acres a year, right? A dramatic reduction. And it stayed relatively level into about the 1990s, and things started to change. And now we burn somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 to 9 million acres a year. I think last year we burned over 10 million acres through wildfire. And so you've seen all of a sudden that both legacy of fuels and climate change, as I'll talk about in a minute, begin to manifest itself in a big way. So what does an unrestored stand of pine look like, right? When you take fire out of an ecosystem, this is loblolly pine in the southeast United States, this is what happens, right? And if this gets very dry, you have what you call ladder fuels. You get an ignition in this ecosystem, and it quickly moves into the crown, killing the species. So that's the management case. And that's the argument for actually thinking about forest management and restoration as a way to combat this problem, to improve the resilience of these ecosystems to withstand fire, right? And to reverse the decades-long challenges associated with fire suppression. But of course, the challenge here is not only one of restoration and management, it's about climate change as well. And so our fire seasons today are about 80 days longer than they used to be. Our fires are burning bigger, they're burning hotter. We've lost things like snowpack, which dries out ecosystems faster, right? So we've got extreme weather events that are substantially challenging the ecosystems. Beetle kill. So there are 40 to 50 million acres in the interior west that have been impacted by mostly mountain pine beetles. Significantly impacted by climate change because the winters are no longer warm enough to kill those insects, right? And so climate is having a big signal. Now, when stands like this are initially killed by bark beetles, they burn very hot very quickly. Then the needles fall and the fuel conditions change and they actually become less flammable. Then the trees start to fall over and they become more flammable, and you get different fire conditions. The fires are closer to the ground, right? It's also deadly for firefighters to go into places like this to try and fight these fires. We lose a lot of firefighters to literally trees falling over on them. And so the climate signal combined with the changing fuel conditions has created an enormous challenge for these ecosystems. But I said in the beginning, this is a three-legged stool, right? It's management, it's climate change, but it's also how we develop and where we develop. All right, so we'll see if we can make this go. So let me actually set this up. So this is a fire that happened in 2016, about an hour south of Missoula, Montana. That slide I showed you with the elk standing in the Bitterroot River, This fire is not far from that. When you think about fires in the wildland-urban interface, the way the U.S. Forest Service normally fights fire, right, is they call what they scratch out a line. They're trying to starve the fire of fuel so they can get the fire down on the ground and then they can put it out, right? That involves chainsaws, shovels, other things, or air tankers to try and keep the fire small so people can get to it. Point here is that there's a large infrastructure of folks in the U.S. Forest Service, in state agencies that actually work, in local firefighting offices that actually work together. There's an interagency fire center in Boise that tracks all the resources. 30 air tankers, 130 helicopters, 30,000 firefighters, hot shot crews, type 1 teams, incident command teams, and they're constantly being pre-positioned across the country to deal with the fire threat. The Forest Service now spends about 55 to 60% of its budget on fire. 70% of the federal response on fire is in the Forest Service budget, and it's to deal with the challenges of addressing these. So let's see if we can. Okay, so this is Bitterroot National Forest. See here, there's a fire scar from that fire in 2000. But this is what the fire threat that we're looking at today looks like to a lot of communities in the West and California. The initial wisps of smoke, within 30 minutes, the Forest Service had dispatched a helicopter to look at this. They saw that it was going big fast, so they immediately ordered evacuations. In the town, in the front of you is school. Between the school and the mountain is actually lots and lots of houses. You're looking at the front range of the Bitterroot National Forest, and in the background is wilderness area. This is just one afternoon of one fire, a relatively small fire. It burned, I think, 8,000 acres or so. But look how fast it travels. This fire is throwing sparks in front of it. It's not that the fire has to touch the next tree to catch on fire. It's throwing sparks, sometimes 400, 500 yards in front of it, and that's what moves this fire. What's that? This is probably over about 4 hours, 5 hours. It's one afternoon. And so if this were in the middle of nowhere, right, much easier to deal with, but you put houses in between there and your job is to get people out as quickly as possible. And so we've built an infrastructure of people and others across the West to be able to deal with these fires because they're so dangerous, right? And so this fire burned like this for about 12 hours. And then the weather the next day sat down a little bit and allowed firefighters to actually deal with it. Now, the interesting thing is this fire was kind of two fires. In the foreground, you have community people, houses, right? And it was full suppression. Every air tanker, every helicopter, every firefighter, they could get to it. But once the initial fire was actually stopped moving east, the fire was allowed to burn for probably 4 to 6 weeks back up into the wilderness area. Why? Because the Forest Service now recognizes they can use fire to benefit, to reduce fuels, and so there are a lot of places. All right, now I got to figure out how to get back to. Yeah. Okay, so that was the Roaring Lion Fire, right? Actually a relatively small community. This is the Waldo Canyon Fire from 2012 in Colorado Springs. This is a fire where you had to evacuate people from about 10,000 homes. I think this fire only killed 2 people, but it burned up about 350, I think 400 homes, something like that, covered 20,000 acres. It started burned in a few days, and then it moved about 2 miles in 2 hours. I'll give you a sense, like, think about that. So think if I got in a cab and I went about 2 miles away from here, and I started walking back to campus, right? And I dawdled around, but say it took me about 2 hours to get back here. And in the meantime, I asked all of you to evacuate this campus and to move everybody 5 miles away. right? That is essentially what had to happen here. And so we've built up this infrastructure to deal with these climate-induced, fuel-induced fires that are now burning in places where we have tens of thousands, millions of houses. And the budget implications of that are enormous. 20 years ago, the Forest Service spent 1/6 of its budget on fire. Today, it spends in the neighborhood of 55 to 60% of its budget on fire. Fire season is longer. It takes more equipment. The implications for insurance and for losses are huge. It's also dangerous. To give you a sense of, fly a DC-10 like that, 500 feet off the ground, you can imagine there's a substantial danger. But to give you a sense of the cost of firefighting, that drop is probably $100,000 to $120,000 per drop. And so the costs of this are dramatic. And so if we think we're going to solve this problem with easily or with not a lot of expense, we're wrong. Three-legged stool, the wildland-urban interface has made this dramatically more expensive and dramatically more dangerous a problem. Okay, so I said in the beginning, one of our challenges is that we're dealing with a certain amount of mythology that we have to get beyond to address this problem. One of the pieces of mythology I've already talked about, which is the sense that fire is necessarily a bad thing and that all fire should be put out. We're beyond that. The Forest Service is beyond it. Federal agencies, state agencies, forest industry, everybody is beyond that. But we still have challenges when it comes to this mythology. So first, let's start on the left. I asked the question in the beginning, are these fires natural? I would argue yeah, there are natural fires out there, but I would argue the nature of the problem we have today is not natural, that they're both climate challenges and management challenges. We've built up a debt that we're going to have to deal with. And if you think that maybe these fires aren't natural, right, then the implication is we actually have to think about management, which is another challenge with some constituencies on the left. For a long, long time, and for good reason, management has been a problem, particularly on federal lands. Think about the liquidation of spotted owl habitat, Endangered Species Act. For very good reasons, we stopped that type of management, which was destructive for a lot of reasons. But management per se, management of ecosystems, got a black eye. And the truth is we're going to deal with this problem, we actually have to think about large-scale management. This is a prescribed fire in Ponderosa Pine in the West. So the other challenge is that for a long time, management of federal lands, management of state lands has been very confrontational. It's been litigation in the courts, trying to create new regulations to limit what agencies and others can do. It's been about confrontation. But if you want to do landscape scale restoration across public land, private land, across different jurisdictions, Indian tribes, it has to become much more collaboration, right? So we have to move from a model that is largely about conflict to one that is largely about cooperation, how we work together, even in fighting fire. If you want to feel good about your government, actually watch the way they fight fire. Federal, state, tribal, local governments work very well together. It's a seamless effort to actually confront these fires. We're going to need the same thing actually on the restoration side. The other piece is when you start to think about management, okay, what are we going to do with the wood? What are we going to do with the small diameter timber? What are we going to do with other things? We're actually going to need markets for those. And environmentalists, and I'm an environmentalist, spent 14 years at Environmental Defense Fund. Environmentalists have always been a little bit nervous about markets for wood. If we're going to solve this problem, we're going to need robust markets for small diameter timber and for other wood products. This issue also raises questions about wilderness, right? I love wilderness. I've spent an enormous amount of time in wilderness. Many of you may have as well. But should we be actually thinking about things like prescribed fire in wilderness? Should we actually be thinking about management in roadless areas, right? I realize this is a difficult issue, but climate change, past management practices may actually raise some of these questions for many of us I think we have to confront, even though they may be troublesome. Okay, the mythology is not only on the left. There's a lot of mythology on the right, right? And I alluded to some of it early. the effort to sort of define this only as a management challenge. Yes, management is important, but it has to be enlightened management that is about restoration, right? Which is different than the type of management that a lot of the U.S. Forest Service lands were subjected to years ago, right? So yes, management is a problem, but climate change is an enormous part of the problem. And part of the mythology on the right says, it's just a management issue, right? No, climate change is clearly implicated in this. The other piece is that you'll hear a lot on the right about environmental laws are to blame. If we can only get out there and harvest more timber, we could solve this problem. And it's true that there have been challenges in the implementation of environmental laws on managing and addressing this problem through a restoration. But the biggest impediment is not management. Yes, there are things we can do to laws to streamline them, to tweak them where we've got good science and collaborative groups on the ground doing this type of work. But if you gave me a choice, if I was back in the undersecretary position and you gave me a choice of a whole bunch of money or a few tweaks to environmental laws, it's a money problem, fundamentally. And that's another challenge, another myth that we have on the right, which is that we can solve these problems without the taxpayer actually putting significant resources on the problem or towards the problem. This is not a $10 million problem. This isn't a $100 million problem. This isn't a billions-dollar problem. This is a tens of billions of dollars problems. We have built up a long history of debt, and we have to address that. And so the reticence of many Tea Party Republicans and others on the right to actually spend money is a substantial challenge. During the Obama administration, we proposed a way to change the way the Forest Service budgeted for fire. It's been treated as a normal appropriation expense for very long, which is why more and more of the Forest Service's budget has been spent on fire. The Forest Service has 40% fewer people on the non-fire side of the organization than it had 20 years ago. It's hiring firefighters, and it's not hiring biologists or foresters or others, right? And if we're going to do large-scale restoration, we're going to need money. And so in 2018, Congress finally passed an effort to kind of stop the bleeding on the budget side. But if we don't go back in and recognize that we actually need to fill the bucket back up, that we actually need to go think about large-scale restoration, we're going to continue to have this problem. A fourth myth on the right is that about land use regulation. So if you want to deal with the issue of houses in the wildland-urban interface and fire in the wildland-urban interface, it matters where you build and it matters how you build. We have a pretty good idea of actually where fires will go. We have good science to understand how they burn, what ecosystems are potentially vulnerable. And so we need local communities, right, to be able to actually take that into account into zoning. We also need to think about actually retrofitting buildings with things like metal roofs, defensible space around buildings, right? And that's not a Forest Service, even though Forest Service is actually, think about the distribution of costs of this. The Forest Service and other federal agencies, the state agencies are picking up the cost of firefighting. A lot of times it's way more expensive because of the land use decisions that have been made, not by the Forest Service, but by local communities. And so land regulation actually becomes important, zoning becomes important, and that's another thing on the right that conservatives have been skeptical about. And we're going to need to get beyond that if we're going to address this problem. So let me just touch briefly on kind of a path forward, and then I'll open it up for questions. So on the management side, we need to think about large landscape scale restoration. It's collaborative. It's cross-boundary. It's not 1,000 acres here and 1,000 acres there. It's 1 million acres there. We did a 2 million acre restoration plan in 4 national forests in Arizona during the Obama years. We need to think about that scale. We were talking about 30,000 acres of thinning annually for 20 years, right? We need to think on much larger scales. I've used the term restoration a lot. It's not a perfect term. Restoration sort of seems to be backward looking, right? And in some cases, longleaf pine and others, it makes sense to actually go back and restore those ecosystems to sort of restore them based on what they look like 100, 150, 200 years ago. But we actually need to think about forward-looking restoration because the climate is changing, because we've got new assemblages of species, invasive species. And so what we're restoring is a resilience, right? If you could give me a verb to resilient, I wouldn't use restoration. I'd use that verb, but I don't have it. But we have to rethink about how we think about restoration. Number 3, we need more fire, not less. We need more. It needs to be different fire, but we're going to need more fire. We're going to have to put more fire on the landscape. We're going to have to do restoration and then move fire into these landscapes. And that creates smoke, right? And so we can give you smoke that looks like this, or we can give you smoke plumes that look like the Roaring Fire or the Waldo Canyon. I will tell you from experience that when you use prescribed fire, people complain. They don't like to breathe smoke. One of our realities going forward is that people are going to have to breathe smoke. A little bit of smoke now, right? And we're going to have to get things like the Clean Air Act to understand this. One challenge we had was actually working with EPA, that very constructive, but like having to figure out how do we deal with smoke. So another piece of the path forward is markets and how we think about markets for wood. We need markets for small diameter wood. In California right now, they're doing a lot of restoration, and in places they're stacking wood on the side of the road because they don't have markets to sell, right? And if you think about the timber industry in the West, a lot of, in the past, certainly from an environmental perspective, thought of these mills are taking too much timber off the national forest, they're a potential problem. Mills in places where we have a substantial fire problem are a service provider. We need to keep them in business. And so we need to think about things like actually supplying timber, even if we potentially have to pay them to go do this restoration. And so that infrastructure of mills and forestry, particularly in places like the West, where it can in places not be very economic, is critical. We're going to have to invest substantial resources in firefighting. Yes, this is a fire. Yes, they can be a natural process. Yes, there's a climate problem, but we have to understand we're going to have to be fighting these fires for a long time, and it's going to take substantial resources. And the campfire and others like it are ones that we're going to see more of, not less. The public is also going to have to understand that once these fires get rolling, we actually can't stop. We couldn't stop that fire that you saw, the Roaring Lion fire. It was get out of the way. And the public needs to understand that in cases where we have fires like that it's about getting people out of the way, and that the most important work we do is not fighting the fire while it's burning. It's the work a decade prior to the fire to reduce the severity of the fire through restoration, and over the long term, think about climate change. And that's my last point. We have to deal with climate change. It's a fundamental element of this problem. It's not the only challenge as I've laid out, but climate change is going to be absolutely critical as we think about this into the future. And to give you a sense, the Forest Service thinks we've doubled the amount of acres we've burned over the last couple of decades. The Forest Service thinks we will more than double it by 2050, right, on the current course. And we need to prepare for a future that allows for that, but that allows us to actually have forest people, communities that are more resilient. So let me stop there. Happy to take any questions.
Questions for Robert Bonney. And Robert, I'll let you take your own questions.
Does FEMA, if FEMA wasn't covering some of these disasters, or as FEMA does on floodplains, require certain levels of construction and subsidize that with increased cost of compliance money, would that have an impact? And the short second question, what is the impact on endangered species in controlled fires like this?
So there are a lot of endangered species that are reliant on prescribed fire. David and I work very closely on red cockaded woodpeckers and gopher tortoises in the south. Occasionally you light an ecosystem on fire, you might burn up a species every now and again, but overwhelmingly positive. Your question about FEMA is an important one. So FEMA doesn't handle the disaster while it's happening like other disasters. It's Forest Service, the Department of Interior, state agencies, and others that are in charge. So most of the money for fighting is coming from those agencies. In the aftermath, FEMA can provide grants. But your point, I think you're alluding to potential perverse incentives here, which is if FEMA can come in and help people rebuild and we don't actually learn from it, that's what we've seen in floodplains and elsewhere, then that's a challenge. And so there's some really good work being done by Ray Rasker at Headwaters Economic, thinking about some of those perverse incentives and thinking about sort of, are there things you can do on the fire side, right? To encourage communities to create incentives for communities to actually think about better land use decisions, and thinking about how you tie that to incentives with FEMA and other agencies.
Thanks for the talk. It was very good. You laid out a number of reasons why this would be tricky. To add one more, that you mentioned the local health impacts of fires and prescribed burns. There's also the fact that it releases a lot of carbon. And so what is your response to folks that say that your policy solution exacerbates climate change in the short term?
So forests are a huge part of solving the climate problem in the United States. If you've read the mid-century strategy that the Obama administration put out in late 2016, it's hard to figure out how you solve climate without forests. And part of that is actually dealing with, so the big threat to the sink right now, the forest sink, is actually disturbance, bark beetle, fire, and other pieces. The biggest problem is actually development. It's the conversion of forest to other uses in private forests. And so there are places where, from a climate standpoint, we actually in the short term need to reduce. So if this stand was overstocked, we actually need to go in and take timber out. We're going to reduce the amount of carbon. But over the long term, we're actually going to keep more carbon on the landscape. And so there are places where we actually have to go in, we're going to reduce the amount of biomass, but over the long term, we're probably going to be able to hold on to those forests longer, right? And so there's a trade-off there. And so on this, in the sense of prescribed fire, doesn't have a big impact on kind of the ability of these systems to sequester carbon. The big challenge is that if all you cared about in the short term was carbon sequestration, you might not want to go in and do some of the treatment that needs to be done. What I would argue is over the long term, not only for climate change, but for a whole lot of other things, including people's houses and rare species and other things, we're going to need to do the restoration.
When you burn wood, the wood resin aerosols consist of pyrolyzed organic materials, which are really ugly in terms of inhalation problems, and they're submicrons, so they go deep into the lungs. Would it make sense to have people evacuate downwind of these fires, of these controlled fires, until they're out and the aerosols cleared? And the other thing is, would it make sense when you chop down trees that do not have a lot of commercial value to bury them deep and sequester that carbon so that it does not decay and return to the atmosphere?
Yeah, so I had a professor in forestry school that talked about we had to stick trees in old coal mines for exactly that reason. So I would argue probably, and raise a few eyebrows in here, that we actually ought to think about sequestering a bunch of wood and solid wood products, that we ought to start building 10, 12, 13-story buildings like they do in Europe out of wood, that will create an economic incentive for people to actually hang on to forests. Most of our forests are privately owned. And if we want to deal with the threat of development, we actually need people to be able to make money from forestry, right? And so we actually, part of the thinking about markets over the long term for climate change is not only addressing this problem, but thinking about how do we get most private landowners where most of our carbon is being sucked up to actually maintain their forests. So on your first question, so this is an enormous challenge. As I alluded to, we had a lot of back and forth with EPA on it. And so you may have heard this summer, there was enormous challenges for maybe a month in Seattle, and people coming in because we basically smoked them in Seattle. And so you had people coming into hospitals. It's an enormous challenge. And so for prescribed fire, generally what is done is you wait until the weather's right, and you basically can, there are days where the smoke will disperse a lot better. The challenge is we don't have that many days. And so we actually have to think about exactly what you're thinking about, which is hey, we may need to do prescribed fire on a large landscape, and we may actually have to tell people that have asthma problems, emphysema, all that stuff, to get out of town, and it's going to become a challenge.
So you spend most of my time in Red Lodge.
Great part of the world.
Exactly, right on the Bear Tree Train. We watch these fires happen.
That slide of the beetle kill was from the Custer.
Yep. And we watch this constantly, and one of the things I wanted to say is this is a really long-term issue too. Like one of the things I think we in Montana are like, hey, we're over here, we burned last year or we burned 5 years ago. But that was my question was,
Yep.
But if you go there now, it's beautiful, but there are trees on top of trees. I mean,
Yep.
it is so thick. Luckily,
Yes.
it burned the pine bark out, which is
Yep.
good. But now we need people and money
Yes.
and these ranges are huge. I mean, we're talking thousands of, acres. So what do you see as the solution to then thin the forests and like, from that standpoint of we're not hiring people, we're not, and it can't even be a community. I mean, there's only 2,000 people in Red.
Yeah, and you've basically, I mean, the number of mills, big mills that you have in Montana, very small, long way away, right? And haul costs matter. It gets more expensive the farther you have to haul the timber. That tree doesn't sell for a whole lot. That tree sells for a lot. This tree is fire resistant. That one isn't, right? And so it's interesting because one of the things, you hear a lot about polarization around environmental issues. And despite sort of my sense that we need to think about addressing mythology on both sides, there's actually a consensus growing around a lot of this, that we need to do large-scale restoration, and that it's going to take collaboration, that we need those mills to stay in business. And so organizations, the Wilderness Society, the Wildlife Federation, other folks in Montana are trying to figure out how they keep those mills in business to actually deal with this problem, recognizing that we're actually going to have to put money on the table. Yeah, it's
110 in the summer. People think, oh, it's cold.
Yes, and we are, as I mentioned, we're moving a lot of people into firefighting, and there are fewer people to do this work. It's going to cost a lot of money. There are businesses starting to think about this, both on the bioenergy side, on kind of the restoration side, but we're going to need a significant infusion of resources to be able to deal with this. And in places like Montana, there's very much a bipartisan consensus around this. Bullock has been great on this issue. Your governor, my chief of staff, is now his chief natural resource guy. And so, and Matt Mead, Republican, great on this issue. Butch Otter, who was the governor in Idaho, we work closely with also. There's this bipartisan consensus trying to figure out, hey, we actually need to keep the mills in business. We also need to do forest management in a way that buys social license. We don't need to go back to the old timber wars. So even amongst industry, there's an expectation, hey, this forest management actually looks a little different. It's different than what we used to do 30 years ago. And so the big challenge, again, we don't have to go in and gut the Endangered Species Act or NEPA or other things. What we really need to do is recognize we're going to put some serious resources on the table. And if we put resources on the table and do smart, large-scale restoration efforts, that we can actually address this problem.
What you're talking about is intentionality, intentionally doing things rather than reacting to unintentional calamity. And how do you deal, how are you going to win this debate when the press and the legal realms punish intentionality so much?
So it's a great question. But again, I actually think we're in a place now where there's a growing bipartisan consensus about how you address this. And so as I think of the quote-unquote politics of this, like how do we actually put together the coalition that provides both the resources and the support for actually doing large-scale restoration? I can think about the coalition that will bring together the Wilderness Society and the National Wildlife Federation and the timber industry and mills and others and governors and local county commissioners. I can think about how you put together that coalition. Biggest challenge is it's going to take resources. It's going to take rethinking the level of resources, and that more than anything is what I worry about in terms of how do you create the long-term political fix that sustains the work that needs to be done over a long period of time.
But the news media wants a simple story. They want fire to be bad, and how do you get them to give a more nuanced story? Otherwise, everybody who pays any attention at all is going to think fire is bad. We have to fight it.
Yeah. So I mean, if you look at the coverage, it's actually a really good reporter. at the New York Times doing work on this. And so the press has actually started to come. I actually worry less about the press now. And I actually, when I'm out, talking about this to the public, there's a sense that that there are things we can do, and there's sort of buy-in around large-scale management and that sort of stuff. To me, it is fundamentally how high a priority is this, and how do we put together or how do we get the coalition to put money on the table? Media is clearly a part of it. I mean, we spend an enormous amount of time talking to the media to try and educate them. And one of the things you do is you think about, you sit in government, you think about, the lobbyists are coming to you all day to ask for things. A lot of what good folks in the government do is actually reach out to the media. Hey, we actually need to educate the media. Reach out to the interest groups. Hey, we actually need to figure out how we put together coalitions. And it's that kind of intentionality that on both the Democrat and Republican side they're going to be really important. By the way, the guy that has my old job is a guy I know really well, Jim Hubbard, was appointed by Secretary Perdue. He's really good. He's really smart on these issues. He had a long-time career Forest Service who spent his career trying to figure out stuff like this. And the agency itself, the Forest Service, is an entirely career. There's no political appointees there. And so, there's enough bipartisan consensus around this if we can stay away from tweets that talk about raking and other things. There's actually enough bipartisan consensus around this that I think we can actually move this forward.
One more question.
Ernie, you mentioned a little bit during your talk about restoration, not just being a look back, but kind of looking forward and planning for new species or potentially like landscapes with kind of impacts of climate change. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what that means, especially like in the West, like our pine trees and the kind of species that we typically associate with these iconic forests, really going to be well adapted for what we expect to see in the future, and what impact does that have on nature?
There's a lot of uncertainty, right? But I'll go back to Montana, actually. There's the Helena National Forest. There's an ecosystem or a area outside of Helena, Montana, where there's a community that is built right up next to the national forest, and it's in lodgepole pine. And unlike the ecosystem like that, lodgepole pine tend to burn more catastrophically on longer rotations, hot, right? And there were several thousand acre. They didn't tend to be like the 500,000 acre fires that we see today, but you saw bigger, patchier, more extreme fires. And so if you want to protect that community outside of Helena, it means actually doing some things in that ecosystem that aren't what that ecosystem did 100 years ago. And so it means getting into lodgepole pine and actually thinning and thinking about putting in prescribed fire. And so from a endangered species standpoint or a wildlife standpoint, I'm manipulating an ecosystem that doesn't actually entirely look like what it looked like, right? And I would argue that that's an appropriate place to actually think about that. We can still provide significant ecosystem service benefits from that ecosystem. By the way, that's where Helena gets its water supply, right? So we need to protect the water infrastructure that's there and other things. And so those are the type of choices we're going to have to make. And so, there are places where it's not going to look quote unquote natural like it did, and we're going to have to make trade-offs. And that's one of those places where you have to look into the future. Hey, if we got a fire here, we actually have to think about how we get it out of the crown and onto the ground so we can put it out so we can save lives and houses. And those are the type of trade-offs that we're just going to have to deal with. And if you add in invasive species or other things into that mix, it just makes it much more complicated. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty. We're going to have to try different things, right? You're going to experiment out in the woods. And that's just a little bit the reality that I think we're in.
Well, Robert, thank you so much.